Welcome to the All Access Podcast from the experts at Tevis. Each episode, we'll talk about technology topics, trends, or solutions that manufacturers need to know in today's rapidly evolving times. Sit back, enjoy the discussion, and let us know what you think.
Welcome again to another episode of the All Access Podcast, brought to you from our new studio here at Tevis America in Troy, Michigan. I am your host, Michael Thiessen, and we're bringing to you news, updates in the manufacturing sector, and giving you a little bit back in terms of information that is out there in order to make your life better, easier, and more productive. I'm happy to say that we started our new season, and thanks to you listeners out there, we are operating in another season again. We've got lots of topics in this season here, some additional topics. If you have topics, let us know. We would love to dive into those topics and bring them to you in order to make your life more productive. Well, today we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic, and our guest that's going to be on the podcast is, I can say this, a very influential individual that has a lot of influence on what's going on in the manufacturing sector in the area of making laws introduced to the White House and so forth. So I'm very excited. On the podcast, we have today Mr. Omar Nashashibi. He is a founding partner of the Franklin Partnership, which is a bipartisan lobbying government affairs consulting firm located in Washington, D.C. And he works with the members of Congress and the White House on behalf of various clients in the manufacturing sector on a variety of issues from trade and federal funding opportunities. With that said, I'm going to be jumping right away. And Omar, thank you so much for being on this podcast.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me today.
So for some of our listeners that have not heard about the Franklin Partnership, how can you explain what you do and how important this particular partnership is?
Well, thank you. Let me just start with, we have a saying here in Washington, D.C., and that is, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And that does not really a place where you want to be in this town, whether it comes to regulations, increasing taxes, adding tariffs, or one of those places. A lot of industry just isn't well represented in Washington, D.C., and it's my job to work on behalf of manufacturers and other groups at our firm to put their point across on Capitol Hill, to help lawmakers understand how the impact their decision is going to have on average Americans, on manufacturers, on the supply chain. We lobby every day on legislation, on regulations, on rules, and try to help those folks that are making these laws, help them really understand the real world impact, whether it's trade, taxes, education, workforce. One thing about manufacturing, they're impacted by every single policy issue out there. It's not just a one-off. Manufacturing is in everything.
Mm-hmm. So I think I can say it this way. You work very closely with the manufacturers, with organizations that represent manufacturing, very closely together. Is that accurate?
That's right. At our firm, what we do is we lobby on behalf of 5 different manufacturing associations, totaling 3,000 manufacturing companies. And that 3,000 business base gives us a lot of companies with which we have to work with, and there's a broad range of industries, anything from automotive suppliers to aerospace and defense to agriculture to, of course, medical device that played such a big role here in the last couple of years. And they're located throughout the country, and they typically will average between 50 and 150 employees for the most part. And so they are the definition of American small, medium-sized businesses that are keeping everything going.
Now, obviously, we are members of the AMBA, the American Mold Builders Association. I've seen you talk in various instances with them or with the group of the AMBA. Is that the only organization that you work together? You said you worked with multiple ones.
We do. We've had the pleasure of working with the AMBA for a few years now. They hired us to work on their behalf, on behalf of the industry, with regard to some of the threats coming from the Chinese plastic injection mold makers and the subsidization and the government help that they provided over the years. In addition to the AMBA, we also work for the Precision Metal Forming Association. Those are the metal stampers, National Tooling and Machining Association, tool and die folks, Precision Machine Products Association, a lot of Swiss machines in those shops when you go through them. and the North American Die Casting Association, which gives us a pretty good base between those different associations to have exposure to everything from the red metals to steel, aluminum to plastics, and have a really good understanding of some of the challenges that they're all facing based on what we're hearing.
Mhm. Well, obviously, technology in the industry that we're working with, or even the environment that we're working with, changes on a daily perspective. Changes are happening so quickly. How often are you in contact with these constituents or with these groups in order to kind of get the pulse from the manufacturer to see what is really hurting them or what's really causing them pain?
Almost on a daily basis. So yesterday, for example, I heard one in Indiana, one from Oklahoma. I've got a call today with another one from Pennsylvania. What's really helpful for us is the more we know, the more effective I am at my job here in Washington, D.C. Pre-pandemic, especially whenever I would travel, which I was traveling almost every week, I try to go to a plant tour. That's how I learned, seeing the process that's out there. Going to see laser cutting, hydro cutting, friction welding. I mean, these are some things that are really fascinating technologies that are being done right here in the United States that not enough policymakers know about. And I think if they were better informed, they'd then make better decisions. And that's our job, is to be able to be that go-between, because elected officials, folks from the White House, they can't go do those plant tours as often as we can. So it's our job to be your voice in Washington, D.C. And so connecting with the actual manufacturer, that is an essential part of my job.
You know, I find your job and what you're doing so incredibly important to our manufacturing and trying to compete with the world as it is today. I mean, we're seeing constantly that our manufacturers are struggling, and it must be incredibly difficult from your side to hear some of the struggles that our manufacturers are going through and trying to stay alive or compete even. I have to understand that is quite challenging.
Oh, it certainly is. And I started working on behalf of this industry in 2002. So we're literally going on 20 years here, working with many of these businesses. And I have seen how their priorities have evolved and changed with some sense of urgency. We do an annual survey for our 5 associations, and we're just sending it out to folks at Department of Labor last night, the section on workforce, and being able to look at the historical trend lines of where that has fallen in terms of challenges our manufacturers have in recruiting qualified workers. And so there's no question that you can see how that sense of urgency ebbs and flows. During the Great Recession, for example, in 2008, 2009, again, about 30% of my members are auto suppliers. Try getting a loan during the Great Recession. If you were in that industry, you were untouchable. Try getting accounts receivable insurance, also not an option. Based on conversations with industry, we were able to lobby and create a small business lending fund within the administration that was going to be able to back some of these loans that the banks were then finally able to make to our industry. I mean, I had profitable companies that were trying to buy up those that were going under and saying, look, I can expand, I can hire. I just need the capital. And so at that point in our cycle, that was a big issue. But that ebbs and flows. Right now, obviously, it's supply chains, raw materials, I know we'll discuss, but forever workforce. Workforce, even from the Great Recession through now. I mean, you did not get rid of your tool and die makers, your journeymen and women. You forego a paycheck yourself, and you made sure to keep those skilled people on. And that's one of those areas that I've seen continue. In my 20 years working with the industry, is workforce still remains one of the constants. Unfortunately, it remains a constant.
I can imagine last 2 years throughout the pandemic, your phone must have been ringing off the hook with people trying to figure out what they can do if there's PPP available. And early on, at the early on stage of the pandemic, there was no such thing of, well, what can we do? Is there a PPP available for the manufacturers in order to stay afloat? Because at that time, we didn't even know how long this was going to be dragged out.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I think you hit on something extremely important, because the policymakers themselves didn't know how long this was going to drag on. I mean, for example, I spoke with a moderate Democrat last summer, and he said, back in March, had I known where we would be today in July, I probably wouldn't have gone for unemployment extension of insurance all the way to September. But you didn't know that at the time. We didn't have full vaccine rollout when they moved that bill back in March. But no, absolutely. The last couple of years, especially those first few months, there was a lot of all-nighters, And when you are working with small businesses, I mean, many of them do have an HR department. They're very sophisticated, but they don't exactly have a large, robust legal center or a way of where do you find credible information. And we were doing daily updates, at least through March and April of 2020. And then now we've went through weeklies, bi-weeklies. Now we do a monthly slide deck on where things are with COVID, supply chains, and do presentations just to keep people updated, because there's still just a flow of misinformation and information that still continues to come out there.
So hopefully I'm not jinxing by what I'm going to say this now, but I think we're in somewhat of the post-pandemic. And like I said, hopefully I'm not going to eat my words now. But now we have another situation that we have on our tables, and that's the Ukraine situation with Russia invading Ukraine, with barrels of oil now being stopped, and obviously it's the correct thing to do. How is all of this situation now in the Ukraine affecting our manufacturers and our constituents, or your constituents that you have over here?
Oh, it certainly is. And in my job, well, the way I approach lobbying when I go see with a member of Congress or an elected official, the first thing you do is obviously you establish credibility. And then next step is, why should they care? Why should listeners care about what's going on in Ukraine? And obviously, other than the reasons that are out there for humanitarian and geopolitical and borders, let's just get straight directly into the manufacturing. Why should you care? Let's talk about how do you make steel? If you're a user of steel that listen to this, which many people are, then we have to think about how those two countries play into it. For example, pig iron is a major component of steel production. And the areas that come out of Russia and Ukraine accounts for 60% of the U.S. pig iron supply. And without that, you're not making steel in the United States. Globally, Russia and Ukraine represent 7% on the Russian side and 4% on the Ukrainian side of global steel exports. So we're not exporting a lot of steel directly in from Russia or Ukraine. We do bring in some aluminum and a decent amount of stainless or aluminum from Russia and stainless on the Ukrainian side. But it's these raw materials and these inputs that ultimately go into the steel and the aluminum that many of our manufacturers use that is critically of concern. We also look at it from a standpoint, I know that it's easy for the politicians and media point to the price at the pump. Price in the pump is painful. There's no question. We're going to get into the summer months when it gets even worse. But if you're manufacturing, it's not just about putting fuel in the gas to make a service call or into the truck to make a delivery. It's about the shipment of goods and the transshipment of goods and on the ocean liners. And if you look at Europe is obviously significantly reliant on the petrol and the oil coming out of Russia, but it's also those ocean liners that are going across and carrying goods and raw materials and products to here in the United States. And I think that's an area where we're going to want to look at. When we squeeze one area of the trade community, it usually has a ripple effect that will continue. And whether or not they're full trading partners, or if we get rid of permanent normal trade relations and MFN for the Russians, it still is going to affect our trading partners. It's going to move around the demand for goods. That's going to increase that demand and competition that you all face.
Right. So now we have been dealing with China and some of the other importing countries for quite some time now already. Our manufacturers over here, of course, they're trying to compete. And naturally, from the governmental side, the only way how we can potentially leverage the playing field, so to speak, a little bit is by introducing tariffs. Explain a little bit how these tariffs work and how a manufacturer that is over here in the U.S. can potentially compete with some of the products that are coming in.
Sure. And you have to actually start with the premise of, does a tariff work? I think the vast majority of folks in the trade community are going to say no, they don't work. And you have to first accept what is the intended goal of a tariff? Is the intended goal of a tariff to get China to buy more American goods? If that's the case, then they did not succeed. They only bought 57% of the committed goods that they did from the United States over a 2-year period. So they fell quite short with respect to that. If you're hoping that the tariffs were going to lead to the Chinese stop of intellectual property theft, they monitored, they tempered a little bit, but as far as we can tell, it's still business as usual over in China. With regards to government subsidization, the continuous use of state-owned enterprises, which is what you all are competing with. You're not competing with a Chinese company. You're often competing with a Chinese government. And so let's talk about what the tariffs were. They were an effort by the previous administration to try to punish China into the effect using a stick approach in hopes that they would cease some of their illegal trade activity. The previous president put a 25% tariff on imported Chinese goods in 2018. Thousands of products were ultimately ramped up to that 25% rate, in addition to another tranche that's called List 4A that has a 7.5% tariff. Those tariffs are currently in place. There are only roughly about 88 products that are currently not subject to the tariffs that previously were on China. They received what's called an exclusion. You can have a domestic company here in the United States that imports a product that doesn't want to pay that 25% tariff or 7.5% and claims it cannot find the good elsewhere. So they were petitioning the U.S. government, and the government in some cases was granting those exclusion requests to not pay the tariff. But right now, thousands of products are currently still facing the 25 and 7.5% tariffs on China, and that's where we stand today.
Right. From one of your AMBA conferences that you just attended recently, you talked about these tariff rate quotas that are intact in order to kind of facilitate these 25% on steel. And depending on whatever that quota is, it limits the amount that can come in either afterwards, if it's coming out from other countries, such as I think it was Brazil, that they have a quota limit that afterwards it cannot go in, and then from Europe there is certain quotas that can come in, and then it is lifted. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is. And I think it's important for folks to, exactly the way you just described it. We have two types of tariffs. We have the tariffs that you mentioned on China. Those are the Section 301 tariffs that in our lobbying capacity, we fought to make sure they're in place on plastic injection molds. The idea was if you're going to have tariffs on China, you should also obviously include the plastic injection molds and some of the dyes and others if you were going to go that path, which they did. And we continue to secure those. The other side of the tariff discussion, as you mentioned, is on the steel and aluminum. The previous administration also put into place a 25% tariff on imported steel from around the world and a 10% tariff on imported aluminum. They had a couple of exemptions for Australia and then looked into doing an absolute quota system for Brazil, South Korea, and Argentina on aluminum for a few of them and steel for the others. And that system still remains in place. And as you described, is accurate. An absolute quota is once you hit the limit of the amount that's permitted to enter the country from that product line, then no more is permitted in. What the United States just did recently with the European Union instead is called a tariff rate quota. What that means is when the product comes in from that country, say one of those EU member states, once you hit that certain threshold that's been agreed upon, then the 25% tariff comes into effect if it's steel or 10% if it's an aluminum. So what companies have to start looking at is every Monday afternoon, Customs puts out there what's called the Weekly Commodity Bulletin Report. Every Monday afternoon, you can see how much is actually left before that product category is filled. So, for example, you can go in and you can see plate cut into length from Germany and how much is left in that. You can see some hot rolled, for example, flat roll products, hot dip from France, that's already been filled since February 7th. From Germany, it filled on January 10th, meaning thereafter, the 25% tariff was in effect, which is important for companies to understand from a pricing standpoint, from a quoting standpoint, especially because the quota on steel is quarterly and it's semi-annual on aluminum.
So you had also mentioned in a previous discussion, you're not the only one in Washington, D.C. that is a lobbyist that has influence. There's multiple other areas, the retail market and all of those things that potentially want to have these tariffs lifted because then they can get these products in cheaper and sell them in cheaper. I have to assume that maybe the manufacturing market is not as powerful as the retailers. Is that a constant battle between the retailers and how can we as the manufacturers over here get potentially the upper hand?
Well, I think manufacturing certainly has advanced in the last few years, especially with the election cycles having quite a bit of focus on manufacturing. I think that this administration in particular has been looking at domestic supply chains and the disruptions that we've seen over the past 24 months now, and how can we really not just reshore, but reorient some of the aspects of the supply chain and where it looks right now. The retailers, to your point, yes, there's certainly, when it comes to the China tariffs, they are looking to lift those. Some are saying that these 25% tariffs, is part of the inflationary causes. Others will disagree with that. But there's certainly an effort right now in Washington, D.C., when it comes from those categories to try to do something with the tariffs. And I think there's a lot of different constituencies around. Manufacturing, like I said, has really turned the corner in terms of constituencies on Capitol Hill. They see us not just as a single employer, but they see us as part of a chain reaction of employment. What that means is you all are producing a part that requires labor, but then you're also using packaging, using plastics, you're using insurance, you're using legal, you're using all of these services that are different than just a brick and mortar in many cases in some of the other industries. So we look at it as a value added in terms of a political footprint. And manufacturing is a very significant political footprint. And I think we've seen some significant progress in the last about 7 or 8 years.
Now, obviously, there are several bills that go in front of the House as well as the Senate in terms of lifting or the exclusion of tariffs. You had mentioned there was a time frame, something like, I think it was the 1st of March or 1st of April, I think, but more or less it's more going towards the Easter holidays that potentially this is going in front of the House and the Senate. Is that correct?
There is currently legislation that deals with trying to shore up the domestic supply chain while at the same time trying to counter China's technological rise. I think many folks have seen over the last couple of years the challenges that we have with advanced semiconductors. We don't really make the advanced types of semiconductors here in the United States, neither does China, but that is the concern, that they will continue to move forward, and those are operating everything from our phones to our vehicles to our planes and our boats. And increasingly with the Internet of Things and manufacturing 4.0, you're increasingly going to see how that affects a lot of the machinery and their intercommunications, and it's going to require more of that type of technology. The Senate last summer in June passed by a vote of 68 to 32 legislation that would spend about $250 billion, including $52 billion specifically on incentivizing domestic manufacturing of semiconductors here in the United States. In addition, they also had $5.2 billion for STEM education and workforce funding, and the House bill that they passed included $450 million to create manufacturing hubs around the country that would foster these areas of innovation where you can have public-private partnerships, multiple businesses partnering with local educational institutions, their local chapter or district of a trade association, and other stakeholders to try to create a whole of government and a whole of economy approach to supply chains. And it's one of the rare bipartisan measures that's moving through Congress. It's actually of substance. There's a couple of bills that we've seen over the last decade become law: America Competes Act of 2010, and then the Revitalize American Manufacturing Innovation Act of 2014. And this is going to be right up there with it. I think this is going to be one of the more significant pieces of legislation to become law that will benefit manufacturers, not just immediately, but also finally create a roadmap, create an industrial policy. Not like with China updates theirs every few years. We don't even have one, let alone one to update. And so this is going to be an important, long overdue first step for American manufacturers.
I think you had mentioned in regards to these lifting of these tariffs, obviously our constituents or our members, I shouldn't say our members, the AMBA members, the manufacturers that are over here in either Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and wherever they are members of, they don't want to see, of course, these tariffs being lifted because it gives them a little bit of a level playing field. What chance do we have to maintain the 25% tariff on there so that we have a better chance in competing? And should we not get this chance to stay on it, what kind of impact would that have for our manufacturers?
To your point, the retailers are an effective lobby in Washington, D.C. They are trying to lift the 25% tariffs out there. What the argument that manufacturers have successfully been making is the point of trade is, of course, to have intercommunications and fair and balanced trade. But at the same time, if an importer is trying to just seek a lower cost alternative, often we need to start looking at what is the total cost of ownership of that product, especially when you're factoring in transportation, lead time. It's not just a price, whereas that's what you're looking at on a contracting standpoint. So we're trying to explain that if you are going to allow for the lifting of tariffs, there should be a test. And the test is, what steps have you taken since July of 2018 to seek a domestic U.S. source for that imported Chinese product? Or have you even tried to find it from an ally, whether it's Europe or somewhere else in the world? other than China. I do believe that ultimately there will be some lifting of tariffs or reorientation of tariffs on certain products in the coming months. But the lobbying is quite intense up on Capitol Hill right now. So it's unclear whether or not Congress will, on their own, unilaterally lift it. But the hope is that we'll continue to succeed and we create a process that a transparent process we go through over at U.S. Trade Representative's office.
I think creating a process is a great idea. And I think it could potentially be significant in order to kind of give the manufacturers a second chance and say, hey, listen, you need to look here domestically to see if you can get this done here. Do you think they're going to find a loophole to get around this and either lie and say, yeah, I've looked, but we can't do it?
So we have seen that. Obviously, we've definitely have seen those companies where they say, "Oh, we contacted suppliers," and then we reach out to our mold builders who have had them as customers previously, and they said, "No, haven't heard from them in years since they left the first time for China back in 2012, and then again in 2014." So there's no question. What we did is we worked with the U.S. Trade Representative on exactly that point, saying we need some kind of a question, some kind of a certification that's out there, and that's why in the fall they did add that question of what steps have you taken to source here domestically, because you need to hold them accountable. Now, the important part is the government does make this a open process, publicly posted online. And so when we were filing our objections and saying, no, I can make this in Iowa, I can make this in Indiana, we can make this in Western Michigan, I just made this for the company 2 years ago before they left. Of course, we have the capacity to make it here. And I know the Harbor Group has some great data on what the capacity utilization rates are and what our current availability is. And we have it. And we take that data to the federal government and say, look, we're at 68.7 capacity utilization rate right now in the country, or wherever we were at that time when we were fighting this. And that is very effective. Having that hard data and information from our members, our manufacturers, went a long way in saying, no, they did not actually do their due diligence by trying to source domestically, and we can prove it.
So you're actually going to be policing it. It's not just the statement that somebody can put in there. You are doing the research then and proving that potentially they have not done the steps.
Absolutely. We watch it very closely. We file objections and say, here's the current capacity. Here's my quote ability. Meaning you all. We source that information from you all. And 100%, we will object. We have plenty of time. We'll do that publicly. We preempt it as well in our conversations with people in the administration when we continuously provide them updates on what you all are seeing, especially because they want to know what is the capacity for many of these critical products. You all are making goods that ultimately are producing medical devices and other critical inputs for the defense industry that this administration knows that it needs. So that's how we were successful in the past, and I think we've got to keep doing that. Otherwise, you're right. Someone can just issue a statement saying, I tried, inflation, expenses, I have to get this no matter what. The sky is falling. Well, no, you need to be a lot more credible.
So let's switch gears a little bit, because you had an interesting topic where you mentioned the semiconductor area. Of course, we're all seeing the effects right now. There's millions of cars in lots ready for chips. The phone industry, actually, I tried to order a radio and it's all out of stock. And the reason is because no chip is available. So if we bring this manufacturing back in, and the previous administration, this administration were very eager to get manufacturing back domestically again, what are some of the challenges that we're running into? Because obviously, we used to be a very manufacturing powerhouse back in the 60s and the 70s. We were the powerhouse for manufacturing. It seems like more and more we have become, so to speak, the sales country, and doing a little bit less manufacturing because we're doing it overseas. So how can we get this technology back in? And do we have the people that can actually run this?
Well, there's 2 points you just said that are excellent. Let's just start with those 2 words. You said technology and people. And those are a couple of the issues here. A lot of the 90s, maybe back into the 80s and into the 90s, early 2000s, we were designing and engineering here. We just weren't building and manufacturing, producing here. We were exporting it. We were exporting our technology, in effect, and we were literally handing it over to the Chinese because that's required at the time for 20 years. If you're having a JV with them, you literally have to give them your technology if you want to produce at a low cost over there. Things have changed. It's not as much of a low cost country as it was before, but we are definitely seeing some changes and some concerns. The way I would look at it is, let's start with the people conversation, because people create technology. We have the landmass, we have the space. We are increasingly starting to see the government have a more flexible attitude towards building of factories, and even in this administration, mining and extracting those rare earth and critical minerals that we are going to need in this country. Then let's go to the people. Part of the people issue is a perception. And that perception has been, look at me, I went to a community college for 2 years. That wasn't the roadmap that either my parents or the educators around me had for me before I went to finish off my undergraduate at a 4-year. The plan was to go to University of California system for 4 years that would then send me to another UC system for 2 more years, which would send me for another 2, and I'd be done with about $500,000 worth of debt when I graduated.
Right.
That was the plan in the roadmap for many
Correct.
of these institutions, correct? And that's starting to change now. I think we started to see a slight change around 2013, 2015, but really the last couple of years has expedited the focus on credentials and on apprenticeships. So now if we are going to build these systems, which the government is, we have a $250 billion is being put into law for apprenticeships, a $235 billion for apprenticeships, a $50 billion increase over last year is going into money now from the federal government. That's a significant amount of commitment. Another $15 million to focus on youth programs to help them with training for getting them job ready while they're still in school for after school hours. There's a big government push now. Why? Because you all asked for it. For a decade now, you have been telling us, you, the manufacturer, saying I have a shortage of workers. In my recent survey that I do that includes the AMBA, 95% of my manufacturers reported to me in January 2020 that they have at least one job opening. 23% of my manufacturers reported they have 6 or more job openings. That accounts to about 10% of their workforce, since they average about 70 employees each. Can you imagine? You've got about 10% of your workforce open. What's that lack of productivity, not just to your company, but to the American and global economies? And that is the challenge. So now we've started to convince our policymakers, after you telling them all these years, I don't have job openings, I have careers available. These are family sustaining careers that we have available in every congressional district in the country. But how do you now get people here? We have finally caught the car. The government is giving us the funds, giving us the resources, and letting us write the playbook. But now we've got to bring the people in. And I think you're starting to see, how do we transition some of those that might have been in the service sector that don't necessarily want to be working and closing the kitchen at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning to open it again at 10? What family careers are available in manufacturing? So the technology will get there with the people, because the best thing that you can have in any civilization is your greatest resource, and that's the human mind. That's where creativity and technology and manufacturing innovation comes from. But right now, we're just struggling on that supply chain talent. It's retaining and attracting and recruiting. That's where I see the biggest problem right now.
I mean, our customers at Tebis, when we go to our clientele all the time, the biggest thing that comes always up, do you have a user? We're looking for users. Now, there's constantly signs out there looking and hiring. Creating these manufacturing jobs here too, and getting people attracted again to the manufacturing area, this all takes time. Do we have time to get this done? Because it's not like a light switch that we can switch off today and the people are coming in like floods. It all takes time. How long do you expect until we have these youngsters again attracted to the trade area? Because the problem is, from the 70s on, the message was, if you're not going to college, you're not going to make it anywhere. And now we have to change that mantra again. And I just looked recently at enrollment figures at universities. These enrollment figures for the last 2 years have come down. There's not as many kids enrolled, but at the same time, they don't go into the manufacturing sector. So how can we or the government attract these youngsters again to do something with their hands? I think it needs to start at the high school level, or maybe even before that, to have kids again working with their hands.
You're right. And there's two parts of this. You've got to build a pipeline, sustain that pipeline, and then also think, where are you going to put them? Let's start where are you going to put them? If it's the semiconductor industry, the lobbyists for those folks tell me it'll take them 18 months from breaking ground to get in a foundry and be able to start fabricating many of those advanced. And that's if everything goes right, which it won't. And you think about all the raw materials that you've got right now, the shortages in construction and then permitting. So if that's going to take you 1.5 years just to get up there, where does that leave us in the technology race? I just wrote an article for our companies on apprenticeships It's never too late until it is. And folks, it is getting too late to build those partnerships. I think it's middle school. I think even I have 7 and 10-year-old boys, and they're very much into the engineering. How do things work? The show, how it's made. They're very fascinated by what my manufacturers do, whether it's letting them watch the National Robotics League and see kids just a few years older than them designing, building, and then battling robots in a cage. There are ways that we need to think about recruiting differently. It isn't just about a paycheck for these folks. It is not. And I don't want to be oversimplified. It's a paycheck and a purpose. They want to be a part of something. How do you compete against a Caterpillar and a union paying $2 more? You have to let them understand what it means to be a part of something, not just in the community, the culture you've created, but the product that you're making. What are you making? Where does it go? How is it changing the world? How is it changing this or that? You need to think differently about how you recruit these younger folks. I'm a Gen Xer, so I certainly am not one to talk to them. But the Gen Zers and the millennials, millennials is too late. You need to be looking, if you're recruiting Gen Zs, you're even on the back end of it. We really need to be looking at those 12, 13, 14. It's just letting them see how it's made. They're curious at that age. That's the best time to get to them.
Well, I'm an avid builder at home, remodel my house, and previously in the working world, I've made patterns and dies in the model world. And afterwards, when the car came out, I could say to my wife and to my kids, I built that, or I had a part in this, and that feeling of accomplishment you can't take away. It's one of those best feelings that you can get, that you said, I had a part in this. Now being at Tebas, our members and our clients, they're working for SpaceX, that bringing the rover to Mars and getting you up in the moon, all that kind of stuff. I can literally say my software had a part in this. And that's also something that is very good. But this feeling of accomplishment, we need to get back into these kids. And yesterday I was reading a report where it just said, well, in trade, if you go to a trade, you can make X thousands of dollars a year. And if you go to college, you can make a lot more. And everything is about money. And it's not so much about the accomplishment that you get afterwards when you build something. It's all about money. It seems like it is today.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I think some of the younger folks are starting to view that differently. The problem is those that are training and those that are offering the positions and sometimes educating these students are still part of that money mentality. There is a lot more to it, especially when it comes to job satisfaction. I know plenty of folks in the service industry that are extremely satisfied. They are very outgoing personalities. They live to serve people. And many others, yes, you want to be able to see something made. We have a manufacturer that said 700,000 rounds of ammunition that should be in the Ukraine border. If they aren't today, they already would be there by now. So that's something which they just donated. They had a board member that said, I'm on the board of a company that makes this. How do we get it there? So they got in touch with somebody at the State Department, and before you know it, there it went. That is something, not just an extreme and current example, but it is very important. You want to have that sense of ownership. And I think that there's a lot of that to offer in a manufacturing career.
So for our manufacturers that are over here, are there any grants available in order to get kids trained up? Is there anything available for schools? Are schools getting pulled in saying, hey, listen, you need to have, again, a shop class or a machine shop class that before you didn't have anymore because it was on the kill list, so to speak, of not doing anymore? Is there anything available?
Absolutely. And our firm has a monthly grants tracking matrix. I encourage everyone to reach out to the AMBA and they'll be able to show you what we send them. It breaks it down by every state as well. And you can go into by state and see what tax credits might be available, what funding in terms of grants could be out there. For example, I'll give you an example of one from the state of Michigan that closed back on January 19th. It was $3 million in total funding under a grant program that for each recipient under a total $90 million program that was dealing with talent enhancement, increasing worker productivity, developing of workforce skills. And they have programs like these throughout the country. I tell folks, you send enough of your money to the government, try to get some of it back. They're actually trying to give it. They want to give it back to you. They often just can't find you to do so, which is why it's really important to work with your trade association, get to know your elected officials, your mayors, your county commissioners, folks at the state level. they're going to be extremely helpful in helping you get a grant, get a tax credit, or more importantly, build an ecosystem locally where you can have the grant recipient be the local high school or the vocational school. And that way, everybody in the community can benefit from that program or the new machine or the brick and mortar grant that came through. There's a lot. Every state has some kind of a program out there. I look at Colorado's got a skills advantage, job first out there. Florida even does research and development tax credits. In Connecticut, they will literally give you $50,000 a matching grant if you're working on a new advanced manufacturing technology that can then be commercialized. So there, it's out there. Believe me, I know it doesn't feel like the government's trying to help, but they, for the first time in my 20 plus years, really at least have some better intentions than they have in the past.
Right. So if you're an AMBA member, go to the AMBA website. You can find probably a lot of information right there. If they're not AMBA members, or if they do not belong to any association, where can they go to find out what kind of grants or items are available?
If you're going to the federal level, that's the one place where you can go to grants.gov, grants.gov. But again, those are going to be geared more towards institutions, and they don't typically give from the federal government to private entities. But if you have a nonprofit or an educational institution, that's the place to go. On the state level, unfortunately, it is a case-by-case basis. You'll have to go into each state's grants area. Our team, we have a research department that already has a system built up. But ultimately, if you don't even know where to start, reach out to your member of Congress or your senator. They literally have a staff person. It is their job just to look at grants, and they are more than happy to take care of their constituents. Happy constituent equals happy vote.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is very important for them. I mean, I know in Canada there are these grants available from the Canadian government. Over here, we've not heard of this much because it's not been in the pipeline so much, but I think it's very important for our manufacturers to hear there is ways that you can get young kids trained up and being efficient in the trade.
I think you're right. And I think that we've started to see, though, more at the federal level coming out to that point. For example, for a youth program, we've got a workforce pathways for youth that has come out from the federal government Department of Labor that's out there that's offering a $2.5 million. And we know some companies that have started to apply with consortium and nonprofits for those. But I think you're right. But now the federal government is increasingly starting to do that directly and not just leave it up to the states to fend for themselves.
Right. So now we're coming up to one last point. Now we're coming up to the midterm elections that are coming up. Do you see that there is any danger for our manufacturers that things could flip either in the positive or negative direction, or is the ship pretty much on course in order to maintain our manufacturers with these benefits?
I think you'll see a few things. The House looks like conventional wisdom is that it flips from Democrat control over to Republican control. The Senate is still up in the air. Democrats could still hang on to the Senate. Republicans do have a decent chance, so you can say it might be a 50-50 over there. But then let's look at what would happen if the Republicans were to take one or both, knowing that President Joe Biden, Democrats still hold the White House for at least 2 more years. What that would likely mean is you would not see as much moving through, certainly not in the U.S. House of Representatives, in the form of legislation. Bipartisan legislation, likely we're not getting much of it now, but you'll probably see less. Typically, when Republicans are in power, they're not as supportive of some of the workforce and job training funding, although they have improved over the previous years. So if we do have one or both controlled by Republicans, I would not expect an increase in job training funds next year, likely because we probably won't even have a funding bill. They'll just extend what we're currently doing. Same if you're in the defense space, that should be a concern since this funding law that was just signed was likely potentially your last one for some time with regards to defense programs. They will just continue under current operating budget levels with a slight haircut. So those could be some of the areas. But really what we are expecting, and we're prepping a lot of our manufacturers for, if there is a change in control on Capitol Hill, you will see a lot more regulatory activity from the Biden administration. We're already seeing OSHA and EPA get ready to issue a number of regulations. A new overtime threshold is expected to potentially be announced in April that could go take it from 35,568 to anywhere from 53 to 58,000, with some calling it for an 83,000 overtime threshold exemption. Same when we get to, they're talking about doing a heat index rule, which looks at when it gets to 80 degree heat index indoors, OSHA would have requirements. So I think the election outcomes, if Republicans were to take one or both, you would increasingly see a Democratic administration move forward and look more internally. I don't think that you are going to see a lot of bipartisan opportunities, especially looking at the makeup of the House Republican caucus right now.
Well, hopefully we can win all the battles that we have in front of us. If that battle is supply chain, making that better again, because obviously we'd like to see a lot of the things stocked on our shelves again. And the other battle is the workforce, making sure that our kids have a future in manufacturing and getting back in there again. And then, of course, the other one is making sure that our prices don't go through the roof, because if we increase our wages and all that kind of stuff, that all has a direct effect on our manufacturers, because they need to increase the price of their products. And of course, the supply chain issue with the resin issues, the microchips. Hopefully we can win all those battles. That would be a nice future for our kids.
Hopefully, but the prices are still up there. I mean, when we look at even some of the steel prices, and on aluminum, we're at, over this recording, we're at $4,000 a metric ton, nearly double where we were in February of 2021. That's pretty significant. I mean, when we look at the polymer, the PP inventories that are out there, from what we're hearing, and on the plastic sides, a lot of folks are just kind of hanging on as they see prices keep going up. And we still haven't reached the prices on some of those resins that we were at in February and 20 or even October of 2021, but they're definitely back on the trend line, which is creating a tightening supply chains. And once you have to keep in mind, many of us, even if you're in different sector, let's say you're in plastic or metals, you still often are still using the same cardboard, the same packaging, the same logistics company, the same warehouse, and all of those disruptions and cost increases still loom on the horizon this summer.
Right. So, Omar, if some of the listeners that are listening to this episode right now and they have a concern from their manufacturing side, is there a way for them to contact you directly, or do they have to go through some kind of association?
Well, typically, again, we lobby for 3,000 companies and 5 associations. So if you're one of those 5 I named at the earliest, please certainly go through one of those. And if you're not, I'm certainly always happy to help any manufacturer that reaches out, whether it's a question on customs and tariffs, or the latest on tax incentives and any opportunities on grants. Feel free at any time, just reach out to myself, and happy to help out where we can.
Awesome. Omar, any final thoughts from you that you want to give, or maybe tidbits of interesting items that's happening in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I'll kind of conclude where I started. If you do not have a seat at the table in this town, you are on the menu. You really are. I've been in these meetings where they say, well, we haven't heard from them. Okay, well, they haven't heard from them. Guess what we're about to do to them? I mean, especially this is true when it comes to taxes. And if you look at trade and tariffs, if we weren't there to give you a seat at the table, early on we weren't. And the tariffs were lifted. We were hired and the tariffs were put back in place. Members of Congress right now are so eager to hear from a manufacturer, they're falling over themselves. We have members of Congress coming out to us. I got a call on Tuesday with another one, and they want to introduce bills all the time that deal with supply chains and manufacturing, and they're asking for our inputs, and they're trying to find a bipartisan way to go about it. If you don't talk to them now, when you really have their attention, you're losing an opportunity. And I know people dislike politicians, but the government is in your business, whether you like it or not, and you're better off having a relationship, because I'll tell you, even if it's a person that you completely disagree with on every issue possible, if they meet you, if they tour your shop, they see your employees, they will think twice before voting on a bill that will hurt your industry. And I really am a big believer is if you don't stand up and at least introduce yourself, they don't know you're there to help you, and they certainly might hurt you.
Exactly. Omar, it was a pleasure talking to you. It was a pleasure to have you on this podcast. And hopefully all of our listeners are really listening to every single word that you're saying in order to get their eyes opened. And I hope all of them are getting to the table and not just being an item on the menu. So for that, thank you, Omar, for being on this.
Thank you.
All right. To all of you guys out there, you heard directly from our link in Washington, D.C. of what is happening and what you have available. Look into those training grants or those training items that can help you and can help your youngsters be participative in your shop. Talk to your local high schools to see if there are kids that want to go into the trade, and make sure that our kids that are starting in this industry have a future, and that we can maintain our trade and can increase manufacturing again at a higher level. With that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you guys have any questions or items that you'd like to bring to the table for our next episodes that are coming up, please do so. Get in contact with us. With that said, I thank you. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and all the best to all of you manufacturers.
Thank you for joining this episode of All Access. Please leave a comment or review with your feedback or what you'd like to hear in future episodes. To learn more about manufacturing technology solutions and Tebis's capabilities, visit our website at Tebis. That's TEBIS.com.